So I figured in lieu of the time of year that we would do kind of like a Geechee-style red rice, red beans and rice, which also kind of goes along with everything we're talking about because it is really very much like a jollof or so many cultures have different terms for it, or like arroz con pollo. Like it's basically a rice with like all the good things in it, right? It's a one-pot dish. You can make it kind of more stewy or drier, make it more like a rice, like really just a rice dish. So it's great to do on an open fire. So I figured, why not? And I'm just going to start with. I've got a little bit of garlic-infused olive oil. We have an olive grove here, so obviously I like to use lots of olive oil because we press our own olives. Here I've got a little mirepoix. It's just some celery. It's really a very classical mirepoix. It's carrots, celery, and onions. It's got a little garlic and a little fresh thyme in there. It's just so fast, right? I mean, honestly, anything on the fire smells good. I'm like, the chicken's going. I've got a jerk chicken going. I figured I'd start it because we need a full meal if we're going to do this. And I've got some plantains we're roasting. So this is a smoked habanero orange salt. Less traditional, but delicious. Growing up in New York and just being around like so many different options and just all the different kinds of food and things like that. My mom was a chef, and so I grew up like just kind of in the whole like lifestyle of, you know, cooking for others and that kind of thing. And I fell in love with, I guess, not just the food, but I think also it is really the lifestyle of it. I love the history of it. I love, I always say, tell me what you eat and I can tell you who you are. And I think it's because it's true. It's like we are, you know, I think we don't even realize, I didn't realize how Afro-Latina I was until I went to culinary school. And I was like, things that make me feel like home. And when they were, you know, we had these assignments like cook something that makes you feel like you, cook something, you know, what you've learned now, but based off of like where you come from. And it was always these like really Latin things that like my grandmother used to make and that my mom then made, you know. So I feel like food is, it really is the universal language, even more than music. And I fell in love, you know, it brings people together. It's like, it is the most communal thing you can do, right? Culinary school was always, because my mom was a chef, and I knew how to cook, it was always something I thought that I would be able to do later on in life. I didn't think it would be something that I would do now, really, you know, or at the time, because it's been over 10 years. But it was kind of one of those things you're like, oh, you know, I'll take up like gardening and photography, like in my, you know, in the sunset of my life. And that didn't end up happening. And I was sitting in my kitchen one day and I remember this commercial came on. I didn't even know what the commercial was for, like what school it was for, because it wasn't where I ended up going. I ended up going to Le Cordon Bleu. But I just remember it being like, it looked like another life. And I was like, appetizing. Yes, I could use another life right now. I just needed a break, you know? And I called, it was a Friday, I'll never forget. And they were like, oh, perfect timing because we've got a new session starting on Monday. And I was like, oh, what have I done? I was like, sign me up. I'm ready. And honestly, it's been a whirlwind since then. But it was one of the best, like in my, I think of like my top 5 best decisions I've made in my life. It's definitely in my top 5, for sure. What is soul food? Soul food, I watched a documentary the other day and I thought it was really well put. And the chef, who happens to also be a food historian, the way that he said it, he said that as Black Americans, we're the only people that have attached like a spiritual notion to the food that we eat. And I never thought of it that way. I mean, it's brilliant, right? For me, it was always sort of like, it was American food, you know? I think he put it a lot more eloquently, but I always grew up and it was American food. It wasn't so much like, this is soul food. Because we didn't call it that amongst ourselves. It was very much just like the food we ate on Sunday after church. And it was the food we ate that we knew, like, you know, my godmother would make and like the ladies at church would make. And it just felt good. And it was like filling and nourishing. And it felt like us. And I think that as I've gotten older and as I've studied and as I've kind of like figured out more about who we are as people in food, I've learned that like so much of it really is so tied to the culture, to the history. You can't really separate the two, you know? And so I just think who we are as Black people here in the US especially, and even, you know, I decided to do some things kind of throughout the whole diaspora because I feel like we are all one, but it is so signatory for who we are here in this country, and how we are so tied to the land. And I think that that's really important, and I think it's really powerful. Oh man, the first thing that comes to mind when I think of soul food, I think of like smothered turkey wings and like definitely like red beans and rice, and I think of like greens, like all the greens. You know, it's funny, it's interesting. I remember like I grew up in Harlem, and like especially in the summertime, this is before like the whole like farmers market explosion and all that stuff. Like a truck would drive up from down south every weekend. It'd sometimes be like a Wednesday, but it would be like you knew when it was coming. And he would post up in certain areas in the neighborhood. And like my mom would be like, okay, you need to get green beans, you need to get lima beans, I need you to get corn, check the corn. I need you, you know what I mean? Like she was like, but it was like every mom was sending all of us out to just go and like, and it was such a, I guess we didn't realize how special that was at the time, because it was like the farmer that was like driving up. So there was like this, like we didn't, I guess we didn't really appreciate, I didn't know to appreciate that this guy, not only has he like grown this beautiful, really lush stuff for us, but like, you know, just drove up, like, you know, and that he knows everyone in the community also to let us know that this is the time, this is the best stuff, you're gonna get the best this at this time. You know, it was beyond seasonal. It was like what he could fit on the truck, what was the best crop, what was the best harvest. It was such a, there was such, like, it's such a personal relationship, you know, that you really had with your food. It was so farm to table. It was so veggie. It was so much of that, you know, and all these things have become very trendy and very like, oh, you know, especially very California. But like, I grew up like that in Harlem, you know what I mean? Like that's how we ate. I think also when we look at soul food, considering it as American food, like I said, it's hard to separate it from the history. But I think when you look at, there are certain things you can tell that like this came directly from the continent, right? And you're like, okay, like when you look at like black eyed peas and yams, all the potatoes, all the sweet potatoes, the juca, the cassava, a lot of the stewed things, you know, a lot of the things that we consider today. You go to the grocery store right now or to the butcher and you try to get oxtail. And you're like, how much do you want? And you're like, what? This was something they used to throw away. You know, it was something that like, it was what was left over. And we turned it into this beautiful, really fabulous dish that is one of my favorite things to eat, oxtail. I love oxtail. It's delicious, right? It's like, what's not to like? But that's something that like was not considered a delicacy. It was not considered cuisine or fine dining or high end at all, right? And now in some of the most, you know, prestigious and notable restaurants, chefs are bringing this into their menus. And I think that that's really, I think we, I feel like that it needs to be talked about more, that that's something that like, where that comes from. Again, because with it, there's a lot of like, there's a dark side to it, but there's also there's a real triumph and a real beauty and a real like sense of survival and perseverance, and how like, regardless of what we're given, we're going to make something nourishing and beautiful and delightful for our families and for ourselves. And I think that gets glazed over a lot, that this comes from a real expertise. You know, when you think about, especially like Gullah Geechee and things like that, when you look at the history, these people were real agricultural, like masters, you know, like they were sowing rice in their hair, you know, to know that they would have something, because they didn't know what was here. So they would know that they would have something to really sustain them here. They're able to grow rice in completely ridiculous, like you look at like this topography is insane. Like how do you grow anything? And yet it was thriving. You know, it became one of America's largest and most really lucrative crops, right? So when we look at like, where do we see the food? I don't think you can separate us from it. It's literally in everything. It is everywhere.
Cooking. Oh man,
I'm a saucier, as you know, so I feel like sauces are everything. I didn't go in there planning to become a saucier. I was always like, oh, and how about we make a sauce with that? And like all the things that I was learning and that I was, you know, being able to play around with, I became just enthralled with the fact that like you could douse something with something, or, you know, just smother or pour or dip, and just how elevated it became. Let's see. Well, I mean, I love to eat, so it's hard because I do center all of my events around food. I'm like, will there be food? I think I would have to say one of the most memorable, other than just being in culinary school in general, would have to be like, we grow coffee and tomatoes in Colombia, and we were doing that really intensely about 2 years ago. And like being on the farm out there, it is so kind of like back to basics. And like slaughtering our first pig and being able to like from literally, we've done it many times since then now, but that was the first time for me. And so that was like, wow, like this is good eating and like this is how it should be. And I'm a big believer in like, especially with as much meat as I intake, I do feel like there has to be a sense of responsibility to it. Even if it's just knowing where it's coming from, I feel like it changes how we eat. And so for me, that was a huge kind of like pivotal moment because it was scary and exciting, and it really kind of got my thoughts going. And and then to be able to sit there and to use all the butchery things that I learned, to fabricate this animal into like recognizable pieces was exciting. And then we cooked it in like a billion different ways. As a Black female chef, the resistance that I've found is that people are more uncomfortable with you not making soul food than with you making soul food. And so what I ended up getting was like, even like while doing my cookbook, or like a lot of times I've done TV shows, like, where chefs have made backhanded comments because they feel like, why would you know anything else? I've met more resistance there, quite frankly, than anything else, which, I mean, obviously we're, as a Black woman, you're accustomed to ignorance all the time. But I think that hit home in a way that I wasn't expecting. I think because the picture of American like food is always coming from a Black woman, but as soon as you put on a chef coat and you're like, hey, let's add a beurre blanc and let's do a mother sauce, and everyone's like, whoa, you shouldn't be using those words, ma'am. It's like it's like I was speaking in like a foreign language or like a cuss word. I think that that really hit home for me. I was like, wow, like it is so inherent in our culture, our stereotypes and how we see and view people. And as a Black woman, we are constantly we are constantly breaking through barriers and defining ourselves because people constantly are putting these definitions on us. So that's where I've met the most resistance.